Join us.
Let's walk the talk.
This is 702.
And I understand that Teboho is joining us via Zoom. Teboho, thank you for joining us and thank you for chatting to us about this very important issue.
Thank you for having me, Gershwell. How are you?
No, great stuff, Teboho. Teboho, let's start off by looking at this issue, specifically looking at workplace inequity or employment equity non-compliance. What are we talking about there in this instance?
So employment equity non-compliance, employment equity on its own is a legislation which basically deems to promote fair and equal opportunity for everybody by eliminating unfair discrimination in any employment policy or practice within the workplace.
And I mean, in terms of that, I guess it's easy then to succumb to the idea that, I don't know, that you have lily white workplaces or that you have all male workplaces, and that's basically as far as this non-compliance goes. I'm pretty sure that it's a little more involved than that, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So when we actually think about why the actual act was promulgated, I mean, it came about as a result of apartheid and other discriminatory laws and practices that brought about a lot of disparities in terms of employment and income in the national labor market, specifically for your designated groups, which refers to Black people as defined by the code. So it's your African colored Indian people, women, as well as people with a disability.
So ultimately, it was a system that was designed on your social class, based on numerous factors, obviously taking that into account, that then would determine what your eventual salary would be. So if someone walked in through the door with a disability, automatically that was seen as the opportunity for cheap labor. If you were Black, obviously you were cheap labor. If you in any one of the other categories and designations one can think of, that automatically meant cheap labor under certain circumstances. And the aim behind this legislation, behind government's action, is to try to rectify that.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. When you look at people like women, you look at people with a disability, people of color, if I may put it in that way. Those are all groupings that were previously disadvantaged. And then when we look at the actual law in itself, it really just deems to eradicate all those previous imbalances, specifically within the workplace. Because like you mentioned, that is where it was more prominent, the workplace and socially.
So what I just don't understand is, 26 years into democracy, 1994 happened quite some time ago. Now, I would understand that from the 27th of April to the 28th of April, we wouldn't have seen much of a change or any change whatsoever in terms of salary levels. But surely at one point or the other, someone would have sat down and said, but hang on a second. One of the key things that is obvious and clear about the system of apartheid or that we've inherited and the system of colonialism before that is that certain groups, certain previously disadvantaged and marginalized people are being paid less. And that we need to fix the situation as soon as possible. One would have assumed that would have happened, but clearly it seems not to have been the case. Hello? Teboho? Seems that we lost Teboho. Okay, let's take a quick break and then try to get Teboho, re-establish the connection with Teboho, find out what is the situation there, and then obviously take the conversation further. It's quite interesting that 26 years later, we're still having this conversation. And for me, it's one of those things that I'm just absolutely flabbergasted by, because for me, it would have been an obvious fix right at the onset of not just democracy, but, soon thereafter. And it would have been an ongoing, I would have assumed that there would be an ongoing campaign to fix the situation. It seems that we have Teboho back on the line. Teboho, how are you doing?
Hi, Gershwell. I'm fine. How are you?
Good. I just thought there for a second that I really upset you and that you decided to drop the phone.
Not at all. It's actually Eskom that's upsetting a whole lot of things.
ESCOM does make our lives interesting, doesn't it? Maybe we should have a conversation with them and their employment equity, find out how well they're doing on that front. But I mean, on a serious note, though, what I was saying before this is that 26 years into democracy, one would have assumed that steps would have been taken to adjust the lack of equity, the lack of parity, for lack of a better term, when it comes to employment equity. I mean, apartheid is long since past. The system of apartheid and its labor system that it created should have been something that was one of the first things that we addressed in South Africa, but it seems that it's still a reality 26 years later. I would have understood if someone was paid X amount on the 27th of April 1994 and pretty much on the 28th of April 1994, you would still expect them to be paid the same amount of money. But between then and now, someone needed to look at the situation and say, but hang on a second, we're really undervaluing and underpaying this particular individual, and that's pretty messed up. And it seems like that hasn't happened.
Yeah, you see, so it really does definitely come with its challenges. I mean, the Act in itself has been in effect for 22 years now. And when you look at the Commission for Employment Equity report, the annual report, it specifically shows there that women only still make up, let's say, 26.4% of top management positions and still earning less than their male counterparts for doing the same job. So the biggest challenge I feel here is, yes, the framework in itself is lovely, but if there isn't a way in which we monitor the implementation thereof, then that on its own comes with its own challenges. But there's been a lot of discussions now in the industry regarding the promulgation of the amendment bill, which basically serves to give your Minister of Labour as well as your labour inspectors more power to ensure that companies are actually being compliant and following on what they need to do. The most critical thing, of course, is to ensure that you do a thorough analysis in terms of your workforce as well as barriers to entry so that you have got a starting point in terms of ascertaining where your gaps are, especially where you're underrepresented, in terms of ascertaining your income differentials and the gaps contained therein, and putting measures in place to basically address these gaps.
I mean, Teboho, you articulated it beautifully, and it's. Am I naive to think though that it sounds far more complex than what you had just described there? I mean, if you have 1,000 employees, if you have 10,000, if you have 250,000 employees, I mean, it's not too difficult to determine how many of those people work at a particular job grade and what the pay parity between those particular people are. So if everyone, and part of the reason why I'm making this assumption perhaps is because I actually have a daytime job and I'm at a particular level, I have a job grade. And there's a salary band that exists for my job grade. So if I'm paid way below what their job grade determines or way above what their job grade determines, then clearly there is a problem and it needs to be dealt with on one level or the other. Surely it can't be that difficult for employers to embark on a similar exercise.
Look, it does definitely have its challenges. I think when you think of it like any piece of legislation, especially now when we look at the labor law framework continuously changing, you would need to have a specialist or somebody that is well equipped and savvy with the topic at hand to sort of know where to start off with. But other than that, of course, there are other types of challenges that one can come across. The biggest thing is a lack of shared understanding in terms of the purpose of what the Act aims to do. In combination with that, you'll find that in certain instances that I've seen in my line of work, that there's low leadership commitment. So it's very hard to get your employees buy-in if there's no leadership right from the top. Other than that, you also find that a lot of employers lack meaningful consultation and engagement with their workforce to basically ascertain. But in terms of now your groupings, you need to ensure that your employees are correctly classified in order for you to get an understanding of where it is you've got your disparities or your gaps.
No, indeed. And I mean, it's, I find it quite fascinating that, we still find ourselves in the space where there is this massive, not massive, but I mean that there are these particular disparities. I mean, one of the things that, going back to the job grade issue that I'd like to understand, I mean, do we not have, or is it not expected that there should be some form of framework that determines the remuneration for employees? Because I'm pretty sure that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be legislated. And as far as I know, there is no legislation of this nature that says, for example, that a CEO should be paid R1 million a month versus a cleaner being paid 3,000 rands a month. But I mean, there is obviously what they call market-related value, this, that, and the other, when you sit down for a job interview and they say, this is what the salary is that we offer. So how is it that we do find that there still seems to be this massive gap in terms of salary bands? Is it just a case of exploiting people from previously disadvantaged, communities and previously disadvantaged circumstances, and saying to them that, listen, you're lucky that we actually even gave you the opportunity to have this chat with us today, and on that basis, we're going to offer you whatever we like?
So for me, I'm finding that it's really a combination of things. You find that, it's sometimes people really aren't getting market-related salaries. You find that the principle of equal pay for work of equal value is also not being applied. Hence, you'll find that, for example, you'll have your higher level structures getting paid more than your lower level structures. You'll also find that you'll get males and females doing the same type of work, but then being paid, a substantial difference. But other than that, as part of the annual reporting to the Department of Labor and Employment, is specifically the EA4, which looks at your remuneration gaps between your highest paid and your lowest paid employees. At the same time, it assesses the inequalities in the remuneration in relation to race and gender on the various occupational levels. So this is one of the mechanisms that the department has, or the legislation has put in place, for employers to be aware and informed in terms of these are the disparities. It's one thing to actually be aware and informed in terms of the disparities, but then it's another to actually do something about it. And that is where we're finding that they're having a lot of challenges. That is why we're also finding that the rate of transformation in the country is also, yes, we are making progress, but at this pace, 22 years into the promulgation of the Act, 26 years into democracy, one would have thought that there would have perhaps been a shift in terms of the disparities, or at least an even playing field that's applicable for all parties concerned.
I have a question from a caller on the line, and I just want to encourage any of our callers that have any comments or any questions to give us a shout on 011 883 0702. Alternatively, please pop us an SMS on 31702. 072 702 1702 is, of course, where you can send us a WhatsApp, either a short voice note, alternatively a text message. And then, lest we forget, hashtag Aubrey Masango Show, either on Twitter or Facebook. That's where you guys can also get a hold of me if you want to make a brief comment on what we're discussing. I'm just quickly going to Tseko in Mpumalanga that called into the show. Tseko, how's it?
Yes, hi, man. How are you?
No, great stuff. What's your question?
Yeah, my question is, Teboho,
Yes.
Yeah, yes. My question is, if you find that you own a same corporate, you're working for the same the employer, they've got permanent. This actually happened last week. I think maybe you have seen it on the news, or you had it on your news. So what initially happened? What is happening? You find that you doing the same job you're working for the same company, but I'm a labor broker is on a permanent basis. So then the previous employer, the previous labor broker, was paying the correct amount. The allowances what they're saying was fine. Then we find a new company comes in as a new labor broker, and he comes. Then he takes all the allowances. Then the rates will just going down. So I don't know how can that one deal with, because it was on the news last week. I think maybe some of you guys maybe have seen it, and I was Teboho as well. I think we have seen or heard about it. Yeah, I just want to quickly ask about that. How can we deal with that particular issue?
Okay, sharp, Tseko. I mean, that's an important point that Tseko raises there, because it doesn't only have to be that individual or that specific case, but I mean, It's been quite some time, and I'm not, raising a case for or against labor brokers per se, but we do know that unfortunately what happens is a lot of the time you will find that labor brokers enter the scene, and then they enter the scene, and then they actually reduce or drop the price of the general wage bill, and I mean that's a serious issue.
So in terms of when someone believes that they've unlawfully been discriminated against in the workplace, so this forms part of one of those sectors or situations where you've got a form of unfair discrimination on the basis of your remuneration. One could basically follow the internal grievance process with the employer through the HR department. If they feel like that situation is not really being resolved to their satisfaction, it can be escalated to the CCMA. If the CCMA is also then a ground where they feel like they're not really getting the results that they desire, then it can be escalated all the way up to labor court. So these basically follow to basically get their concerns heard.
Okay, Teboho, I'm just going to ask you to just stay in the same position because your phone just started breaking there for a couple of seconds. I'm not too sure exactly why, but I mean, which in itself is an interesting one. But what about the situation whereby I find myself, I am working at, I don't know, a particular office, a particular factory, but technically they're not my direct employer. I'm working for them through a labor broker. I mean, that makes it a bit difficult. Or does it at all infringe on my ability then to use the internal mechanisms like a grievance process?
Look, at the end of the day, as much as the employees based at an alternative site, they do ultimately have an employer. So one would then assume that even though their immediate site where they're based is not their direct employer, if I may put it that way, but they've got a contract signed with an employer, in which case the same process can be followed. Alternatively, one could refer the matter directly to the CCMA should they feel like the internal grievance process is one that is an avenue that's not accessible.
And I mean, that creates in itself a very interesting set of circumstances, and I guess that makes it difficult, to then navigate that particular space in itself. But, and then I guess then the key question that we have to ask ourselves then is how do we ensure equity in the work environment? Because there's already, I mean, you're very much well aware of this. Everyone is well aware. The government recently had given us a list, for lack of a better term, or, guidelines in terms of a minimum wage per industry. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if I'm working in this space, there's as a talk show host on 702 or, talk show host with any broadcaster for that matter, there's an expectation that there should be some pegged, minimum wage that I'm entitled to. But the key question, though, ultimately is this, do we then want government to become that prescriptive where every single industry, no matter what you are involved in, whether you're an accountant, whether you are a sweeper, that ultimately government should set and say that, listen, this is what pay parity would be, that this is the band that you need to pay people within? Or how do we ensure then that there is compliance in the space?
So that is actually a great question. One would obviously need to ensure that, they know what the initial position is. It's definitely, I feel that it's a good idea to have government put in all these parameters in terms of minimum wage. Otherwise, you get to the point where, individuals are being exploited. So in terms of now the implementation, so the government has not really given strict guidelines in terms of pay parities, but I mean, one would, when it's apparent, when you do an analysis on each occupational level and you find that you've got two people doing the same job, but one is earning 3, 4, 10 times more than the other, then that is definitely questionable. And in terms of now your annual reporting, these are all the things that the department looks at in terms of why are there such high disparities between people on the same occupational level doing the same thing? Why are there disparities between different race and gender groups? So the department definitely is cracking down on it, especially now recently when I've seen myself do a lot of director general reviews, which is when the department actually comes in and they assess the depth to which you are doing your compliance. So they'll look at things like your employment equity plan, whether it reflects equitable representation, or the aim rather to achieve equitable representation. They'll look at whether or not you actually have a forum that you consult with, so that's your employees, a forum that's fairly represented, whether you are keeping minutes to these discussions, there's proof of consultation. So all of this forms part of the legislation. So the biggest thing that I think we could definitely, or the department could rather do, is definitely carry on the progressive steps that they've taken to ensure that employers are complying.
And I want to get into a conversation about enforcement, because there's obviously a big difference between compliance, where I just comply, I ensure that I do what I'm supposed to do legally, right? Versus someone actually cracking down and making sure that I'm doing that. Because I think on the one end, there may be a legal or an ethical motivation for me to do something, but all too often we find that it's easier not to do that, especially if it somehow inconveniences me. So I'd like to have a discussion about enforcement in just a few. But before we do that, I see I have Godfrey on the line from Joburg, also wanting to talk about labor brokers. And I guess we have to be honest with ourselves here, Teboho. The reason why labor brokers become such a focus of conversations like these is, as much as they loathed, as much as they cause all kinds of problems, they still a very effective means of employment, if you get my drift. Let's hear what Godfrey has to say. Godfrey, good evening.
Good evening, how are you?
I'm good, man.
I'm good. Yeah, I have a question for Teboho to say, do they assist people from the labor brokers when it comes to salary? I'll give you a scenario where maybe you're manufacturing cell phones, right? Same specifications, we bought technicians, maybe a day we produce about 20 cell phones. But when it comes to the pay, the labor broker always gives you a third of what the permanent the technician is getting. So that destroys the moral, and at the end of the day, you ask yourself, am I putting in less, or am I less of a human being, or I'm just being discriminated because I'm from a labor broker? So I don't know if there's anything in place there. And the issue of going to CCMA, trust me, at the end you become blacklisted. And I don't know if there is a law to say if I work for a labor broker for about 3 months, I can get some benefits. You can work for a labor broker for about 4 years. They'll never give you some study leave. You are not entitled to study leave. They don't even assist in you getting better qualifications. You have to pay the fees yourself. So labor brokers are a nightmare. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Okay, thanks for that one, Godfrey. I mean, that was a very interesting question. And I mean, I guess the broader question is, Teboho, and I'll give you an opportunity, obviously, to clarify and to outline what it is that you are doing at Strata-G. I guess that's the important bit here as well, so that people understand what role you actually play in this broader discussion. I'm just quickly going to go to Temba as well in Joburg South. Temba, how's it?
I'm okay in yourself, Keshwan.
No, I'm good, man. I hope you're good.
Good. Keshwan, I'm not one who wants to demonize every innovation that comes in the market that assists the speed at which we transact with one another. But, let's look at what labor brokers generally do. What is it that they do? If there's an employer who is hell-bent on, number one, not complying with the BEE requirements, training requirements, who's not interested in addressing issues of salary disparity. Labor brokers provide a wonderful platform for him to simply say, well, Look, I looked for jobs, I looked for candidates through these guys. I was not involved. And in terms of salaries, look, these guys came in and they said these are the going rates for this particular a resource that I was looking for. You know, and on the other end, when you speak to labor brokers, and I think quite a lot of professionals nowadays would have dealt with one or two labor brokers, they'll tell you that, you know, labor brokers generally try to satisfy the employer because it's their client at the end of the day.
Sure, but I think also the opposite end of that coin, so to speak, Themba, is the fact that, you know, for people also who are in desperate search of employment, I mean, a labor broker is going to come and hire 1,000 people at once, as opposed to hiring one candidate that goes through a rigorous process of A, B, C, D. So I guess that part of the issue there is that, and I'm not blaming people, I'm just saying that.
Labor brokers don't employ. They simply go in the market and they say, well, employer X is looking for 10 people. I'm going to go in the market and look for 10 people. If for argument's sake, that employer is a racist of note and is least interested in having black people in there, and the labor broker knows that. He knows very well that if I bring 10 people that are the most qualified people, because this ultimately I'm satisfying a particular client who has a particular view on a particular thing. He's going to go about it. He's going to get people that are not. You see. I don't know if the point comes out very well. At the end of the day, you're going to commercialize an interest or a perspective that an employer has. And unfortunately, when you go and you ask this employer, how is it that your salary, there's this salary disparity? How is it that your management looks far whiter than snow at the top and darker than the darkest day at the bottom? How is this? How is it this is the case? He simply says, look, guys, when I needed a certain type of resource, I went to labor brokers, and this is what came out of this entire exercise. You can't blame him. And if you go to the labor broker, it says, well, look, if I don't get the guys what they want, I'm not going to be in business with them. Imagine if you were to take, look, there are informal labor brokers, if you want to call it, if you go into public administration, and these informal labor brokers are guys that will ultimately put in their sisters, their cousins, and various other things. Look at the chaos that is in there.
I hear you. And I'm not saying that it's very important what you had highlighted, but I think that the issue here is we don't want to turn it into a labor broker discussion. What we are trying to figure out as well, within whether it be the labor broker space, whether it be the general employment space, is how is it that we fix the current situation where we have these massive disparities. But I think you raised some valuable points there, mate. Thank you so much, Themba. Themba there from Joburg South. I mean, Teboho, he does raise an interesting point. And as I said, I don't want to turn this into a vilification of labor brokers, and the simple reason is that is not really the issue at hand here. But the fact is, whether it's someone that employs you directly or employs you indirectly through a labor broker, the fact of the matter is that we have a serious disparity in terms of people's incomes in South Africa, and that is what needs to be fixed at this point. Now, added to that complexity is obviously the fact that, and I'm yet to see an employment contract that doesn't have this provision in place, where all too often they make it clear that your salary is confidential. Your salary advice, or what we simply call the payslip in South Africa, is a confidential document, and that it should not be shared with anyone. And even the accidental sharing of that document could lead to disciplinary processes. I mean, how do we then navigate that? Because the only way that I could possibly know that I'm not being paid the same as you, as an example, but we're doing the same thing, is if somehow we manage to have a conversation about our salaries, and I heard that you're getting paid 10,000 rands, but I'm getting paid a measly 3,000 rands.
Yes, absolutely. So salaries, I definitely agree, are enormously sensitive and confidential matter. And like you're saying, often contractually, employees are prohibited from disclosing the details of their remuneration. However, on that point, I do actually agree when you say this information always has a way of coming out. We also know that it's human nature to talk after all. Over and above that, the EA4 report, like I mentioned, that looks at the remuneration gaps and disparities, is a report that should ideally be shared in the committee forum. However, due to the sensitivity of the information, it generally isn't. So, in terms of how one sees the payslip, it's definitely by pure accident, as well as people talking. But we also then would need to now look at the flip side of the coin in terms of now rectifying these imbalances. I mean, they've been in place for a very long time. And yes, there is progressive improvement, like the 20th Commission for Employment Equity Annual Report has noted. But it is a dynamic that definitely cannot be resolved overnight. But as long as we're making progressive movement and improvement, pretty much like with the legacy or apartheid in itself, which took years and years to build up, these types of barriers are not barriers that we can basically break down overnight. However, if we've put in progressive solutions to overcoming these barriers, then that's definitely a step in the right direction.
No, for sure. I mean, the one thing that stands out for me, I mean, in our conversation and what we're talking about is obviously what I made reference to early on, and there was the issue of enforcement, right? So my issue is that I don't have to call the police to stand outside my house to ensure that no one burgles my home or that I don't get murdered, if you get my drift. So in other words, it's expected that society and that we conduct ourselves in a particular way, that we conduct ourselves in a, what's the word I'm looking for, in a respectable, ethical, lawful manner. And so too do we expect that from our employers. So how do we then, and I know that you mentioned that more labor inspectors are going to be made available, et cetera, but beyond that, the simple fact of the matter is we want people to comply. And to ensure that they bring their end of the bargain. Is there any steps being taken? Are people being educated about what they're supposed to be doing? Are there a series of workshops? Are there audits being done, et cetera, to ensure that there is actually compliance in the first place?
Yes, so there definitely are audits. There are labor inspections that occur. Just looking at it from our front, in my line of work, I've probably averaged 2 inspections a month, even during the course of lockdown, which were then sort of desktop inspections. So instead of having the inspector actually come through to your premises, they would request some supporting documentation to basically assess the manner in which you actually, or the depth to which you are being compliant. Over and above that, there are ramifications for non-compliance. And we're looking at anywhere between 1.5 million rand to up to 2% of the employer's annual turnover, depending on the nature and the frequency of non-compliance. So, yes, we might find that there are certain employers who are non-compliant or even have some sort of complaints about it. However, the department is definitely approaching it more with an iron fist. And this has also then been evident in the promulgation of the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, where other than the fact that it basically gives your labor inspectors and your Minister of Labor more powers to basically ensure that people who are in violation of the Act are basically, being dealt with. But what they're also doing is pretty much like you've got your triple BE certificate, which one would sort of see as a passport when you want to tender for government business. They're also now going to start issuing things like your employment equity compliance certificate, which will basically have set criteria in order for you to be eligible for it. So it'll look at things like whether or not in the last 3 years you've had any cases of unfair discrimination at the CCMA, whether or not you are paying below your minimum wage bill, whether or not you've got an employment equity plan and you're submitting your EE report. So all of that, especially now for your larger businesses, because the amendment bill is also then going to specifically start targeting at your employers who've got more than 50 employees. All of that's been put in place to basically illustrate to the employers that the department is definitely seeing that there is some sort of resistance from a non-compliance perspective, and these are the ramifications if people are not going to be compliant. I mean, like you're saying, with any other piece of legislation or any law, there's always penalties for non-compliance.
So let's look at what are some of the things that are going to be measured, because I think that you and I have spoken quite nebulously, and that might be my fault, but about what we're talking about in terms of employment equity. For many people, it means different things. From a lot of the calls that we've received thus far, it's a pay disparity across racial lines. We've spoken a bit about gender. But is it just pay disparities? What are some of the things that are being measured? Because one of the things that stands out for me, and in the work that I do, in my daytime job, is that you will find that there is seemingly a reticence to employ persons with a disability. And there's a massive spectrum of disabilities, as you're well aware. And someone might be epileptic, or someone might be visually impaired, and reasonable accommodation doesn't mean that you have to bend over backwards. But the mere suggestion or the mere notion that someone has a disability all too often disqualifies them from gaining gainful employment.
So the types of discriminations one might come across in the workplace. So when we look at the definition of what unfair discrimination is, it basically states that you may not directly or indirectly discriminate against anybody on the basis of their race, their gender, their disability, their sexual orientation, religious beliefs, etc., etc. Now, when we talk about unfair discrimination, it would be things like denial to training opportunities, employment, promotions, transfers, from one entity or one division to another. It would be discriminating on the basis of either your physical or your mental disability in various aspects of your employment. So it would be things like your hiring and firing, your recruitment, your job assignments. Again, comes up the issue of promotion, and the one that we've unpacked quite a lot this evening is where you're being paid substantially indifferently compared to somebody doing the same job but with the same type of experience and qualifications. However, on the flip side of it, there is something also called fair discrimination. So fair discrimination is basically set on two main grounds where one could say discrimination is allowed in the workplace, and it's based on your affirmative action measures. So to basically promote the organization's aim to achieving equality in the workplace without lowering the standards and without unduly limiting the prospects of existing employees. So that would obviously be targeted at your previously disadvantaged groups. And the second one is based on the inherent requirements of a particular job. So that on its own would be dependent on the job and the required qualifications and the experience that would then be required for that particular post.
Just as just as you mentioned it there, another cause for discrimination, for lack of a better term, there would be performance, and a lot of businesses, a lot of entities work on the notion of annual salary increases for performance. The performance bonus aspect, which I guess one can always count into your total remuneration. And if I'm a star employee and my colleague Chris over here basically just gets by and he just does what he's supposed to be doing, and he doesn't then get the rewards that I do, whether they be incentives, cash incentives directly to my salary or to my bonus, etc., there could easily be a serious disparity in terms of what I'm being paid and what he's being paid. And could that be a justification for employer to turn around and say, well, guys, you might be doing the same job, but one is doing a much better job than the other?
Look, there's actually a very fine line, and one could say a gray area when things like that are concerned. But ultimately, like I mentioned, with the inherent requirements of the job, there are various factors that might actually factor into why one is earning more than the other. We start looking at things like the experience that's required, the qualification, your years of service within the particular company. Obviously, if I've been in a company for 10 years and my counterpart's only just been there a year, due to the annual increases, I will, of course, earn a substantial more than my colleague who does the same job but has just started maybe 12 months ago. So, yes, those are all the types of things we need to consider. But now when we're actually looking at the unfairness of it, one would actually now need to look at when did these particular people start? When they started, what were their qualifications? What was their starting rate? Obviously, like you said, it would obviously need to be aligned to what is market-related.
And I think also one of the things that one has to take into serious consideration is also the notion or the idea of what happens over time, in terms of how salary scales change. Because one of the key things I remember many moons ago when I started working, my first formal job, that was back in 2006, right? Where in 2006, I walk into the workplace, a young graduate. Many of my colleagues are not graduates themselves. And one of the key things that raised eyebrows among some of the older staff was the fact that in their minds, they already knew that I was being paid more. And why am I being paid more? Because supposedly I have a degree. And, there's already these ideas that are being put forward, that I'm definitely earning more than them, and I'm earning so much more than what their starting salary was all those years ago. These are difficult factors to take into account there.
Yes, most definitely. There are difficult factors, but at the end of the day, we would have to really start unpacking what the inherent requirements of the job. So what does the job description say? What was set out at the recruitment phase of the process, which actually forms part of one of the barriers that you'd basically unpack during the consultative process. So where do you recruit? On what platforms? What do your recruitment policies say? Do you first recruit internally before you go externally? How do you then advertise your positions? Who gets appointed? Obviously, that would then feed into ultimately your appointments and your selection criteria. So those are all the types of things that you would basically unpack during your barriers analysis to basically ascertain, are there no barriers to entry or any sort of exclusions where your policies, procedures, and practices are concerned. Once you've unpacked that, then you could sort of put solutions into play to say, perhaps my internal staff are feeling excluded because they feel like they're not really getting the opportunities to certain jobs. Then you would really need to start looking at maybe we should change our recruitment process to first advertise internally before we can start doing external advertisements.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think also one of the things that we need to walk away from, and this is this romance that we have with being a graduate in some instances, is that, well, quite frankly, certain jobs just do not require your degree. You could walk in with a PhD in actuarial sciences, but if you are working in a call center, then you can't use that literally as leverage in doing the work that many other people are doing without necessarily your set of skills, where your set of skills are inherently not required, within that particular position. I guess for me, that's what stands out when it comes to that argument being put forward all too often by employers and some employees even. I'm just looking at some of the WhatsApps that have come through as well. Someone says, Labour Department failed me, CCMA failed me. I did open a case against a particular security company after that dismissal. You must just cooperate if you want to work, or else South Africa, no labour law, private companies are playing with me. Please help me. And this is what Lodwick Chabalala has to say. Now, I think on that basis, I think this is an important time for us to have a conversation, Teboho, about what it is that you do and you know, at Strata-G Labor Solutions, being the skills development and employment equity specialist. Because unfortunately, when we do have, not unfortunately, but I guess as you heard, many people have found themselves in very difficult situations. And I guess part of the expectation is when we have a conversation like this, someone is in a position to assist with a solution, for lack of a better term. So what is it that you do, and where can people go if they have certain concerns and worries?
All right, so my area of expertise is particular to skills development and employment equity. I'm a specialist in that area where we particularly go in as a strategic partner to basically assist employers to become compliant. We do, however, have another division, the labor relations or the industrial relations division, that deals particularly with a lot of the commentary that we've heard today where your labor brokers are concerned, and perhaps the question around the procedural correctness of the manner in which certain cases are being attended to. So that is basically the field in which Strata-G Labor Solutions plays in.
Sure. So, I mean, ultimately, your clients, the people that you're assisting are those very same employers, to say to them that, guys, listen, this is how you get yourself compliant. This is how you get on board. This is how you ensure that you are actually in compliance with the law and doing the correct ethical thing, ultimately.
Absolutely. So from a skills and equity perspective, we also do triple BE. So we looked at two aspects of it, which is your people development aspect in terms of, you know, your skills development, your triple BE, as well as your employment equity, which then forms out the whole basket of your transformation. However, from an IR perspective, we also then look at assisting employers to ensure that in whatever they do that's got to do with your disciplinary matters, your CCMA appearances, that everything is basically done procedurally and correct. Because like we've ascertained with the labor law landscape and the laws continuously changing, it's very difficult for employers to stay abreast. I mean, one law that could be effective today could be repealed tomorrow. And that is why we've got specialists like ourselves that are basically aware of all changes occurring, where we would then inform our employers in terms of the changes that have occurred and ensure that the compliance is followed through internally.
Well, thanks for the conversation this evening. All the best to you, and good luck with the load shedding. Unfortunately, I guess it's part and parcel of what we have to deal with. So all the best to you, Teboho.
Thank you so much for having me. Enjoy the rest of your evening too.
Thank you so much.
Experience the drive for tomorrow with cutting-edge design and technology when you purchase a new Audi A4 or A5 with Audi Connect. Choose between a no-deposit offer, low repayments, a guaranteed buyback, or a 90-day deferred first payment. Visit Audi.coza for more or contact your Audi dealer for a test drive. Offer subject to approval from Audi Financial Services, a division of Volkswagen Financial Services, an authorized FS and registered CP. Audi. Vorsprung durch Technik.